Okay, here we go.
Page 1, interesting quote here. Assessment. So look at your case reading right after O'Connor. J. Riley Case, An Unpredictable Gospel, American Evangelicals and World Christianity. He used to teach at Malone College in Ohio. So I think he has a Quaker evangelical friends background. And this I took off of the Kindle version, so we've got Holiness Conversions, chapter 8 from his book, right after O'Connor. Finding it there? So after the paradigm reading, finding it there? Okay. So I just numbered the pages, literally each page. Page 1, on the one side, page 1, right up here, I've got it marked. You know, some of your pages are different sides. On the one side ran rivers that flowed gently but steadily toward mainline Protestants. Waters on the other side rushed toward the holiness movement and Pentecostalism. He's talking about Methodism as a whole. He's talking about the impact of revivalism on American religions or American Protestantism. And there are a lot of people actually that stand or try to stand in the middle. Good question. Is it possible to stand in the middle? Is it? I mean, I'll be honest, there are some persons that have been labeled as liberals, and if you read their writings carefully enough, you find out, you know, I don't think that person's that liberal. They had a basic evangelical faith. They just had an emphasis on social ministry. So I did that. I wrote one paper in a doctoral seminar on the social gospel, and I looked at Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch, his Theology of the Social Gospel and other books that he wrote. And I read through him, and I found out the guy was an evangelical with a real commitment to social ministry. I mean, he was pastor in Hell's Kitchen, and Hell's Kitchen deserves that name. It deserves that name. It was a part of Manhattan where there were a lot of poor people, a lot of drug addicts, a lot of alcoholics, a lot of prostitutes, and he was a pastor there. So he couldn't help but notice the needs, financial, I should say, physical needs. And just like the book of James, the book of James says, how can you say God bless you to a hungry person without feeding them? So just as James declared that, he felt that, and he started the so-called social gospel movement, and other people as well. One of the persons that in Indian Christianity that stands in the middle is E. Stanley Jones. E. Stanley Jones, a Methodist pastor, and you would think because of he had started some ashrams in India, and he was interested in Christian communities, and a lot of people call him a liberal. But when I was looking at Asbury newspapers from the 1930s, when I was doing some research on OMS, he was one of the main speakers, and that's when Morrison was there. So you think about Morrison, he would not have a liberal there. And so you'd see Stanley Jones. So maybe he's one of those middle figures. So some of it went to the liberal side, some of it went to the conservative side. And we will see the cross-fertilization between the holiness movement and Pentecostalism. Many of the forms of the holiness movement have not been kept, but they have been discarded by holiness people, but they have been well preserved within Pentecostalism.
What is the reason for it to destroy?
Well, again, when Pentecostals were, in a sense, trying to continue the tradition, They were emphasizing some of the essentials as they saw them, but they were doing it a little more loudly. And a lot of the holiness people said, we are not Pentecostals. That's when in 1919 the Church of the Nazarene took that out of their name. And so they tried to distance themselves from those people. They're really sisters. But you know, sometimes in families you have an uncle that's a little bit on the wild side. Maybe he's been in and out of prison, or maybe he's done some things that are shameful to the family. And so when you have a family picnic, you never send him an invitation. And if he finds out and shows up at your family picnic, you're disturbed. Why is he here? Who invited him? Uncle John, Uncle Harvey, whatever his name is. In the 1880s and 90s, this is page 1 still, the American holiness movement, through its zealous pursuit of conversions, began ignoring key signposts of civilization, disregarding dominant conventions of race, gender, class, national identity, rationalized planning, materialism, and millennial progress. Let's see where that is on page 1. Rationalized planning, not rationalized, rationalized planning. So what does this mean? The holiness movement was not concerned with building hospitals. It was not concerned with building colleges. It was not concerned with civilizing. What does civilizing people mean? That's when the people of that nation are called the natives. And the natives need to learn English or French, whatever the languages of the colonial powers, Japanese as it was in Korea. They need to learn the colonial language. They need to dress like the colonial powers. They need to ape, copy as much as possible. And so that's why in India, you drink tea and not coffee. Why? Because of the British. That was their drink. Many parts in Africa, you can see also people drinking tea and not coffee because they were influenced by the British. The French drank coffee. The Italians drank coffee.
Americans.
Portuguese drank coffee.
Americans.
Americans do too, yes.
Because there is two, all the Europeans are there, not only British.
In India, yeah, the Portuguese were in Goa.
Yeah, it Goa.
Other places, yeah, around Mumbai. So they were disregarding this. We need to just preach the gospel. Again, OMS has that heritage. Preach the gospel, preach the gospel, preach the gospel. Plant churches, evangelize in church planting, evangelism in church planting, evangelism in church planting. And when you do that, you can end up disregarding dominant conventions of race, gender, class, national identity. What does that mean? Well, as you know, the holiness movement was way ahead of mainline Christianity, including the UMC, in ordaining women. Women preachers were first found among holiness and later Pentecostal churches. Although Wesley had a cadre of women preachers, it was still not accepted by the Anglican tradition, and Methodism was slow. So I think the actual first ordination of a woman in the UMC was in the 40s or 50s, I can't remember, but it was late. And they disregard gender. As you know, many countries, the church assembly hall meeting place was curtained off. Women on one side, men on the other. That was changed in Korea about 1927. But I heard, is it still true in Nepal? You have a women's side and a men's side. And I heard in Latin America that even the Pentecostals were slow to take down the curtain. And they had women and men in Chile. What about Mozambique? Do women and men sit together or separate?
Yes, sit together.
Sit together.
In India, separate.
India is still separate. Okay.
Nepal also. Boys, girls.
Right side boys, left side girls.
Okay. It's interesting in Korea, although they officially lifted the curtain in 1927, when I was serving Korean churches, I would many times not know who Jang No-nim's wife was. Why? Because Jang No-nim's wife, Kwon Sun-in, was sitting over there with her friends, and Jang No-nim, the elder, was sitting on this side. So still in their mind, women sit with women, men with men. And also they had different church ministries. So Jang No-nim, the husband, has to do a certain ministry, and Kwon Sun-in, the wife, has a different ministry. They can't sit together, they have to go separate directions. So there's still some of that preserved. But I think most American churches have completely dissolved that, and men and women, husbands and wives, generally sit together. This whole thing about national identity, or I should say actually tribal identity, we'll get into when we start looking at Amanda Berry Smith. Many of the missionaries, when they go to a certain location, if they go to India and they're in Tamil Nadu, they study the Tamil language and they become proficient in one language. And so they end up evangelizing the people they can speak to. But this is especially more true in Africa than in Asia. There are areas, but when there's a border and people in this area speak Tamil, but you go over there and they speak another language, sometimes what?
Malayalam.
Maybe 20 miles away, 50 miles, 100 miles.
From my place to that Malayalam,
Okay.
maybe 30 to 40 kilometers.
Oh, that close. Okay. So they have to, so in other words, that person who studied Tamil so much, or in Nigeria studied Yoruba so much, then they cannot speak to the other people except in English or in Portuguese or Spanish or French. And so they're limited. So their ministry is only to one group. So then that missionary becomes identified with that one tribal group or one linguistic group. And other people say, well, obviously the Methodists don't want to do ministry with us. And of course, in many countries in Asia and Africa, there was the Comity Agreement. Do you know about that? That was true even in Korea. That's when they took the Korean map and they divided it. This section is for Canadian Methodists. This section is for Northern Methodists from the U.S. This section is for Australian Presbyterians down in Busan. This section is for the American Presbyterians South. This one's for the American Methodists South. So they had it all divided into areas.
In India too.
India also, and many African countries had the Comity Agreement. And you basically don't. Now, what happened was some Baptists came and they threw a wrench in the works because they decided they would preach where God sent them and not where the missionaries, established missionaries, had agreed upon. So they started preaching everywhere and started their churches everywhere. They didn't fit in because they came later, and that's true of other countries as well.
Baptists.
Yes, Baptists in Korea came later, and they started evangelizing everywhere. And also the KEHC, they came after the Comity Agreement had been reached among Presbyterians and Methodists. So they came later and they just said, hey, we're free to preach everywhere. And they did. He started churches everywhere. So this still continues today, right? Even though the map is not structured and it's not agreed upon, there are still places in your country where you can find more Baptists, places where you can find a concentration of Methodists, place where you can find a concentration of Presbyterians. And even in Korea, there are places where there are more holiness churches, even though they went everywhere. And especially where they decided to put their seminary. That established kind of a center of ministry. And so Seoul Theological University started in Seoul, and then it was moved to Bucheon in 1974. The Baptist Seminary, Chimshin, is located in Daejeon. And so there are a lot of Baptist churches in Daejeon. And that's about 2 hours south, 2.5 hours south. So I think it still holds. What about in Estonia? Are there zones where there are more Lutherans or more Catholics?
I think there'd be zones where there are more Lutherans and Orthodox maybe,
Okay.
but yeah, not different dynamics at work, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe there wasn't a map made out, but it just worked. And sometimes it's according to tribal affiliation where people go. So once they start preaching with this group, they stay with this group, and everyone becomes a member of that church. Agnes McAllister, missionary to Liberia. She did follow the standard model of extending Western civilization. She did not. Rather, she was interested in starting churches based upon the three-self standard. So I should say she did not. She did not. Now the three-self model becomes the standard in Korea, even among Presbyterians and Methodists, but they had not started that way. They had started building hospitals, they had started building colleges, but later when John Livingston Nevius came, about 1909, 1910, they shifted gears. So what are the three-self churches? Three-self: self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting. And this is seen in Henry Van, Roland Allen, John Livingston Nevius, and also William Taylor. He mainly just called it self-support, or the Pauline model. The Korean model was adapted from John Livingston Nevius.
And this is why in China it's called three self-church.
Well, it's deceptive because the government official church has adopted the name Three Selves. So they think they've maxed out on this. But this was originally an evangelical model, not a mainline. Because as I mentioned, John Livingston Nevius was a missionary in China who was using this. And he had a Bible school rather than a college. And some of the other Presbyterian missionaries were very angry because they felt that this was shortchanging the intellectual prowess of the Chinese people. So when you start out with a Bible school rather than a college, you're saying these people are not capable of spending 4 years intensive study and getting a Bachelor of Arts degree. And so having a one-year Bible school might get them ordained more quickly, might get them planting churches, but along the way you're going to develop a lack of intellectualism. So many of the churches that adopted this model kind of became anti-intellectual. They definitely did not try to establish graduate seminaries. Now let me tell you a little bit about Korea since I did research for that article on Nevius. Even the KEHC. Early on, all the churches were easily self-propagating. What does self-propagating mean? You go out and do your own preaching. You do your own preaching. Now there were some cases I saw where OMS missionaries were serving as pastors of Korean churches with an interpreter on their side. But that was very rare. And that was only until the beginning of the 1920s. But after that, when the first wave of Korean pastors were ordained, and that happened I think in 1911, and among those was Myung-Jik Lee, Myung-Jik or Sunny. Then when they had Korean pastors, they let the Korean pastors lead the churches, and the missionaries stepped aside. And they said, we don't have to be pastors, we'll just be members of the congregation. So self-propagating means you do the preaching, you do the evangelizing, reaching out, saving souls. That's Koreans. Self-governing means you have elders, and that's the Presbyterian model, which is the majority model in Korea. Elders gather together and have votes and decide what the church will be doing. And of course, some places the actual head, either the conference, bishop level, the conference level, or even the convention level, where they have Korean leader rather than a foreign leader. This was a little bit more difficult, but it was achieved by the 1930s. But in Korea, the self-supporting part was not achieved by the 1930s. The missionaries said, okay, we've achieved these first two. Are you ready for the third? We're going to quit giving you money. No, we need money. We need money. And that again is one of the drawbacks or the criticisms of the three self, is it's putting people at kind of a level of thinking that everyone is on an even playing field. Everyone is capable of earning their keep. But when you have a nation that is so-called unevenly developed, that's the new lingo. It used to be called undeveloped. Now it's called unevenly developed. In the majority world, it used to be called third world. When you have a nation like that that's struggling, and they're in a depression, economic depression, they are facing inflation, they are facing widespread unemployment, and also they're in the middle of what's called colonialism. And that was Korea in the 1930s. They weren't able to do well because they had the government, the Japanese government, on their back. And on, especially in Africa. So becoming self-supporting was difficult. It was a challenge. And so some pastors were still being paid a stipend by the mission organization in the 1930s going into the 40s. And then of course, when the Korean War hit, it was like, hold on a second, we're still not ready for this. We just had a war all over the peninsula. All of our churches were destroyed, our seminary buildings were destroyed. We're still having a hard time. So help us out, help us out. So there was eventually there was a way of kind of weaning the Korean churches off of outside assistance. So that was a program much like in the American model, where people are weaned off of social support, welfare as you might call it, where people are weaned off that, where we have sometimes several generations where people have been living off of welfare. And you don't just say next month your welfare is being cut off and good for you, you go get a job and work for a living. And people say, I don't know how to work, I don't know how to submit a job application. So you have to have training along with the transition economically for people to become independent. So this was delayed. And I think probably not until the 1960s was it really true that Korea was self-supporting. And then by the 1980s, they started the moratorium on sending missionaries. So when I was here, actually it's probably kicked in the late 80s. So when I was here in the early 1980s, the mission groups from OMS, as well as Baptist, Southern Baptist Convention, as well as Methodist World Missions, as well as Presbyterian, they had compounds that housed, Presbyterians had about 50 missionaries nationwide, 50. The Baptists had about 60. And the Methodists had about 40. And one by one, when they retired, they were never replaced. And so I can remember when I came back, I saw the last Methodist missionary was actually a Korean whose wife was American. And he was teaching down in Daejeon at the mission, at the school there. Moblin Gakyo in Daejeon. Okay, Moblin. He was teaching at the Methodist college down in Daejeon. And then when he retired, guess what? There are no Methodist missionaries in this country. There are no Presbyterian missionaries. I remember knowing the last Presbyterian missionary. He's gone. He's back in the United States, in the great state of Washington. and there are no Baptists. The only missionaries in Korea, well, there are a handful of OMS missionaries, but the only mission groups that are sending more missionaries are those that are more fundamental, or in a sense you might say cultic. For example, the Oneness Pentecostals, the United Pentecostal Church International, continues to send a large number of missionaries, and independent fundamental Baptists send missionaries. And I can always tell them on the street, because I know there are no more holiness except for OMS, and OMS got away from the conservative holiness movement. So when I'm walking down the street and I see a white woman or a black woman with long hair and wearing a long dress and no makeup and no jewelry, I know she's either United Pentecostal Church or Fundamental Baptist, because they still hold to that conservative dress style. And the men too are clean shaven, short hair, wear a suit. And of course that's attractive to Koreans. Did you know that? Yeah. Because Koreans see that young Mormon missionary wearing a necktie with a white shirt. He looks so clean. They would like to join his church. The same way for the others. Conservative looks clean and looks outstanding. So again, self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting Islam. Can you say that your church and your nation is all three?
I think that self-supporting might be a little bit of a stretch. The church portion is, the seminary is not,
Okay.
not by a long shot.
Okay.
And I think that is actually something they will have to deal with even more and more since this is location of the Methodist Church.
Nepal? All three yet?
Church is there. Church is there, but
Seminary is still dependent. So again, this is a model that, the civilizing model, ensured that the hospitals and the university or college seminary would be established well from the beginning. And of course, usually for more evangelical or this group of missionaries, they see that as secondary. So they will do that later, and that's later means you don't have money. India?
Yeah, Isha is fully self-governing, self-supporting and self-promoting.
Okay.
They are independent, autonomous body.
All the three we are following. Self-propagating, self-governing.
One good thing is what we are facing today, what is happening today in our country is been visualized by our Father Bishop 20 years back. And he knows that the day will come to India where the foreign funds will be stopped, where the missionaries will be
Yes.
removed from the board, where the missionaries will not get visas to enter into this country. And now he has given us a vision, and he is telling us to move forward along with the centenary vision, that what will happen in next 50 years or 100 years. He is telling you have to be well prepared for it.
Yes.
Be independent. There was a time when our OMS missionaries were in the board, almost in all the boards, and they trained us. And now we are completely self-governing and
When can
throughout India.
When can you say in India, how far back was it that it was, I should say, easy for a foreign missionary to get a visa and live in India year-round? Until the 1960s, 70s, 80s, can you give me a date?
No sir, till 2010,
Yeah.
2000, we can say till 2014, the visa and the immigration was very easy in India. Even though there were some restrictions raised by this government, the present government, we don't have such kind of issues, especially for the Westerners and Europeans to visit our country. But the present ruling party, which came into the main light only before 10-15 years. Like if we say in 2001 and 2000, between 2001 and 2005, they started to grow. within a span of 10-15 years they have grown so much. Before it was not like that. India is open to the missions and evangelism.
Mozambique, Calvin.
Mozambique, many churches are free, but the seminaries need.
Still the seminary is dependent. Interesting. So actually missionaries in many ways were not prepared to build seminaries. And especially when we get deep, dig a little more deeply into William Taylor. His boast was that his missionaries were not on a stipend, were not on a salary. They were faith missionaries. And you also hear that in China with J. Hudson Taylor. Faith missions. And that was their boast, that, hey, we depend on God, not man. And they did not have a good, sometimes they would almost starve to death on the mission field, their own families. And as a result, they didn't have a lot of money to build schools or hospitals. That was a challenge. Okay, Amanda Berry Smith, how about if we take a break and have a little longer for lunch?
Yeah,
And
sure.
we'll start here with Amanda Berry Smith.
I think they're just going to get lunch.
I almost used her autobiography as a textbook. Since Harvey Publishers is publishing it now.
Thank you for coming to class in midst of your difficulties and you had.
I have to. I think it was a month ago I almost passed out at the pulpit. So I told him I can't finish this sermon until I feel like I'm going to pass out. I told you that, right? Went to the toilet and threw up. And then I stayed in my office. Yeah, it was tough. That was food poisoning.
Oh, that is the food poisoning story. Okay, I wasn't clear how long ago that had occurred.
About a month ago. And I scared them to death. And they said, Pastor, you scared us. I said, I scared myself. What are you talking about?
Yes, until the keys.
One of my predecessors,
Is your key?
who actually attended the church, one of the two churches still, he was part of the 2-point charge, had a heart attack during communion.
Oh my.
And I forgot there was someone in the congregation who did the
CPR.
CPR.
Wow.
I have suspicion I know who caused his heart attack, if that is. I'm not joking.
I can have
I do feel there was some.
There are some
sort of
evil people in
significant-
them parts called churches.
This was not the person, but one of the more charismatic members of our congregation did say of one of the people that in her she saw the face of the devil.
Whoa.
So, and that was a little harsh, but I
You
see
turned
where
that
she was.
off already? You better
Oh,
turn it off before we get all the.
It's interesting.